Well, here's the proof, interplanetary climate change, which is NASA's hottest secret. Now, we can look through and find the smoking gun of all 2012 scholarship because we can look at all the planets and the sun and see changes just like we see on Earth. And I'm going to show you a little bit of that. This is a composite graph of solar activity based on core samples from the Antarctic and the Arctic. And what you're seeing is the total amount of sunspot activity. This is what it's been doing in the last few years. We are now at a point where the only time the solar activity was higher than it was right now just so conveniently happens to be 11,000 years ago, which in ancient teaching is associated with what? What happened 11,000 years ago? Atlantis fell, right? Could that be related to the solar activity? Hell yeah. So we're now at the strongest point in 8,000 years since that happened. Mercury has grown a magnetic field when MESSENGER went by in 2008 that was not seen in the 70s with Mariner 10. That's a big change in Mercury. Venus has had a 2,500% increase in this green glow on the night side that you can see there. That's active oxygen. So the atmosphere of Venus is changing back into something that's breathable. Mars is growing clouds and ozone, as you can see right here. There were no clouds on Mars before. That's brand new. The polar ice caps are melting on Mars, and they're actually calling it global warming in the mainstream media. But there's no SUVs on Mars, not that I've ever seen. Jupiter is having these white ovals that were disappearing between 97 and 2000, 3 of them, and then they all meld into one. And this scientist, Dr. Philip Marcus, believed it would cause Jupiter to warm by 18 degrees in only 10 years. Now, if that happened on Earth, what would happen to all life on Earth as we know it? Toast. It's toast. So there's a massive global warming going on with Jupiter. That was the prediction based on what would happen in 2000. That's about the time he did this prediction. He said 10 years. Look at what happens 8 years later. Jupiter is having raging thunderstorms and global upheaval. Towering storms more than 100 kilometers tall. The rare storms, a sign of recent turmoil on the planet. And here's the picture. These bright hotspots were never seen before. This is extra heat that shouldn't be there, and the colors of the rings are changing. Then you go out to Saturn, you're seeing this plasma torus that's grown. All this red area wasn't there before. That's all this charged energy coming from the sun. Jupiter also has one around it, which I just didn't have time to show you in this presentation because we had to shorten it. You're seeing massive X-rays coming out from near the equator of Saturn. That's also a new phenomenon. Again, you're seeing a hot spot just like the one I just showed you on Jupiter, the raging storms, the global upheaval in 2008. Same thing happened in 2004. Where the heck did all this energy come from? The planet just goes, energy comes out. It's amazing. Uranus, as of 1986, looked like green pea soup with hardly any peas, just the green part. Nothing to see. It's just very flat. Now, this is false color, so that's why this is brighter than this. We're not so much concerned about the color, we're concerned about these little guys, because that's what we didn't see before. These are huge storms. Now remember also, Voyager 2 swept by Uranus, so it saw the whole planet. It didn't just see the side that we see. So even with a satellite going past, we're now seeing all these storms that were not there before. And you're starting to see that happen. It was called featureless as a cue ball, but now Eric Karkoschka is saying, really big changes. Now this is more typical of NASA, when NASA says, ground-based observations show seasonal brightness changes, not well understood. Oh, moving on. They try to downplay this stuff. But this is interplanetary climate change. This is something that's happening to every planet. And all they do is they tell you that it's based on the tilt angle of the axis to the sun. The sun is heating it up because the pole is tilting, or because